go forward this way. It leads to paralysis of government and just people not really liking each other at all. And Sam, what do you think about that?
Thanks, Professor Hayes, and thank you, Chris, and Professor Fallows, and everyone for being here. Let me just echo Professor Hayes' words. I mean, this is such a chaotic year. I don't have to tell you that. And I think back not that long ago, a few years ago, the president of the United States was caught on an open mic having a conversation where he pledged our alliance and also that we would be working with the Russian president Vladimir Putin. And this caused made a lot of people upset. It caused a lot of concern. And the president's opponent in the campaign labeled Russia as a geopolitical threat to the United States and to democracy. And this opponent was ridiculed, was mocked. And of course, the president I'm speaking of is President Barack Obama. And the political opponent is former governor and now current Senator Mitt Romney. And the year is 2012. And I say that to say how quickly things change. I mean, how fast the political environment changes on us. And to echo what Professor Hayes just said about going from 2016 to today and the changes that we're seeing. I've spent the last dozen years in our political spectrum, and the two things that I've found to be consistent in politics are simple. The first is that politics is fickle and nothing is consistent. That what's true today is not going to be true tomorrow in terms of politics, in terms of policy and partisanship. And the second is that it is easy to win elections and it's very difficult to govern. And so I think we come to this point today and the question becomes, all right, the election's over. The easy part is done. What does that look like moving forward? I think we're already beginning to see the fickleness and the difficulty of governing settling in the divides between the parties themselves. And the question, of course, moving forward, how will that divided government that is divided within their own parties govern?
Yeah, Sam and I were talking about this, I think, just yesterday, and almost wistfully saying, well, what if the moderates within both parties sort of coalesced and formed a third party, or at least a third and fourth parties, more of a European model of government, because there's now squabbling, infighting within each party. Once you get done with your opponent, how about you beat up your buddy, your fellow Democrat, fellow Republican? We've got two runoff elections in Georgia coming up very shortly, in a matter of weeks, which will determine whether the Senate continues to be Mitch McConnell's operation there for the Republican Party, or whether a 50-50 split, because if the Democrats were to win both of those senatorial seats, we'd have a 50-50 split, which means Kamala Harris would be the deciding vote, and you'd have perhaps a little bit more opportunity for Biden's agenda to get through, although even then it's going to be a struggle. But that's what we have to keep our eyes on now, is Georgia. And to be honest with you, it's kind of scary, the news coming out. And just today, I read that the election officials and their families down in Georgia are being threatened by people who don't like the outcome of the presidential election and want it to be overturned, and are getting increasingly nasty, turning their ire on Republicans. The Republican governor and the Secretary of State are targets. And this is part of this climate that that we're dealing with, and we've got to tone down the rhetoric and find a way through this to actually accomplish something that our elected officials were actually elected to accomplish and are unable to. Look, we still don't have any second response financial help for the average American because Congress just can't get around to deciding on it, between McConnell and Pelosi fighting with each other, and Democrats and Republicans just squabbling away, while many of us, many Americans suffer.
And to your point, I think looking at the Georgia Senate race, it's fascinating because yesterday two things occurred. The first is that President Trump has announced he's going to be going to Georgia this week to campaign for Senators Perdue and Loeffler. But then attorneys who are suing on behalf of Trump, Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell, are now rallying Trump supporters to not vote for Senators Loeffler and Perdue. And so we talked about the split within the party, and you're seeing this happen here in the Georgia election, where the president and attorneys who are fighting for the president are giving competing messages to the voters in Georgia. And Professor Hayes, I mean, you've covered politics for a long time. What are your hopes, or what are your expectations for where you think what we might get done nationally in the new Congress and with the new president?
Well, we have such pressing issues as healthcare, and we are glaring difference between our approach to healthcare and that of most of the developed countries of the world, the Europeans and the Canadians, and we have to really, I think, build on the Affordable Care Act and find our way through to some not only retaining that Obamacare, but expanding on it in a way that is politically acceptable to those who are not as keen on socialized medicine, but not the extreme progressive model of basically free medical care, but find a common ground. I think that finding the common ground on issues like that, and obviously climate change, climate justice, social justice, these are real issues. They're not the catchphrase du jour. These are systemic issues that our culture, our society has to deal with, and we look to Washington and to the states to try to find a way through to actually accomplishing things. Politics should lead to policy outcomes that are help American people, and we're not getting that. We haven't been getting that for a while, and we've got to turn that around.
Yeah, I think I'm hopeful on what you said. With climate change, for example, there's a coalition in Washington right now that are Republicans who want to push climate legislation. Now, the numbers dwindled because a lot of them have retired, but you're looking at former Pennsylvania Congressman Ryan Costello, former Florida Congressman Carlos Curbelo, a number of Republicans, and not necessarily moderate Republicans even, but govern first Republicans, as we label them, that are trying to move on the climate issue. And so I'm hopeful that with a divided government and with someone like Vice President or President-elect Biden in office, maybe we can make some progress. I think my larger concern is a lot of times, and we saw this with the Tea Party and the Republican Party, and we see this with the more progressive wing in the Democrat Party, where sometimes we see that that progress or becomes the enemy of the pure. And I think I'm a little more concerned that with the idea that progress is the enemy of the pure, and what that might end up becoming.
Mike, would you mind muting your iPhone, please? Thank you.
Yeah, also it should be pointed out that Donald Trump lost, but Trump did not lose. That is a reality that is not going away, and the implications are we're again having to find some common denominator that can bring us together, that we can all agree on. Begin to move forward by focusing on those areas where there's more national agreement, because at least that's a start, and it might sort of prime the pump, and we might get into other areas where there's more divisiveness, but maybe the model of success on a few of the more easier challenges can sort of give a model of how to move forward.
Chris, I think you're on mute.
If we are able to figure that out, how does that look moving forward globally?
Go ahead, Professor Hayes. Either one. Go ahead.
Interesting question. We've decided in the last 4 years that we don't like allies. We don't like cooperative, alliances or anything like that. And we've done a lot of damage to our reputation, I think, on the international stage. We backed away from the Iran nuclear deal, which I know is going to have a good debate on that. We backed away from the Paris Climate Accord that we had, and we decided we don't like WHO that much, or any of the other international bodies. And we've got to repair those frayed alliances. And also, to be honest, we had a president who seemed to be more happier around autocrats. And we have a whole host of them in the world: Hungary, Poland, Philippines, the junior Trump in Brazil, Bolsonaro, and the laundry list is long. And if we are going to be a leader in the world, espousing democratic values, you do that by example. You do it by example. It begins at home. And we sort of kneecapped ourselves in the last 4 years. We haven't been a model. Right now, we have an election that for most is open and it should be open and shut case, but it's being contested. It's just more like a banana republic kind of approach to democracy. And we got to, before we preach to the rest of the world, we got to get our own house in order. But we do this. We're a model. This is how democracy should work, and we've got to patch up those relationships we've had before. It doesn't mean we have to go back to exactly the way it was in the Obama years, but I think we do need to understand that the only way to move forward in this planet of 7.6 billion people, of which we're only 330 million, is to work with them, to find solutions. The climate crisis, honestly, I think it dwarfs almost any other discussion we can have. And it's the cause, you can make an argument, that's the cause of the pandemic. If you talk about overpopulation and pushing to areas where we never lived before, a lot of these infectious diseases we weren't exposed to. But then we sort of push in other areas and expand our diet, and suddenly you have, cross species, jumping of disease. So we have to look at the climate. That is, I think that is really job one internationally, is coming to some, not only talking about it, actually concrete steps to do something to mitigate, the greenhouse effect, which really is not a debate anymore. And I think science sort of answered the question about man-made causes of environmental decay, destruction.
Yeah, piggybacking off that, I think it's going to be interesting because the President-elect Biden has already started to assemble his team to address the climate change issue, and I think he's doing it the right way. I mean, it's very easy, like I said earlier, for progress to be the enemy of the pure, and I think he's addressing it in the way that he says we need to build a coalition here. So this includes farmers, this includes business leaders, this includes people that are often kind of thrown out of that conversation. I think where the challenge is going to come in is climate change often presents itself in kind of a prisoner's dilemma issue on the international stage, which is, well, we're all going to join the Paris Climate Accords, but what if someone like a China decides to step out of it and decides to violate it? And do we have enough capital, for example, economically against China and our competition against China? Do we have enough capital that if they violate the rules of the Paris Accords, that the United States can still abide by them and compete economically? And one of the things that we see, this is evidence in the European Union, is that economics tends to trump, no pun intended, but economics tends to trump issues like climate. Not that it should, but it generally does when it comes to governments. And so you have this prisoner's dilemma, which is we're going to be in the climate agreement, we're going to move to mitigate greenhouse effects, but then a country like China that doesn't care about that steps out, and suddenly does the economic interest of the U.S. shift and pull us away from something like the agreements in the accords. I think it gets more daunting in the Biden administration through no fault of his own, because he's stepping into an international crisis with COVID-19. Right? And so there now becomes a situation where how is he going to deal with China on the healthcare issue, keeping in mind that there are economic ties, and then also the underlying climate change issue. I mean, China and India are the worst polluters in the world on this, and how is he going to kind of manage all three of those items in an international portfolio? I think the other thing that's interesting is that in many ways, the Obama administration and the Trump administration came from different directions, but met on certain issues in the international community, and they ended up with certain similar results on some things, not everything. What's interesting is that Biden had a very different record as a senator with doing foreign relations than the Obama administration had, and I'm curious to see what that's going to look like, if he's going to kind of continue his legacy as vice president, or if he's going to make that shift back to where he was when he was a senator.
Other issues on the international stage, there are many. Obviously, we've had engaged in tariff wars. for better or for ill, and we use trade as a weapon. I do think trade can be a bargaining chip in negotiation with China on climate, and that's where having alliances, we're having like-minded governments, the European Union can really come into play, where you can work in concert to persuade somebody, another country, to get in line with remediating the climate situation.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, and that's just going to be, it's the fascinating part, I think, of the international community, where there really is no, like in the United States, right? There's a legislature, there's a president, there's a Supreme Court, there's an entire judicial system at the federal level and then all the way down. We don't really have that in the United States, right? People say, well, what about the United Nations? What about the International Court of Justice? And today I submit, what about the United Nations? I mean, there's no teeth to anything that they want to do. And so it's kind of like all the countries need to agree to it. And so the question becomes, how do you apply that pressure laterally? How do you apply that pressure from between states, between one country and another country? And I think that's going to be the challenge. Moving, I mean, it doesn't matter who the president is. I think that was going to be the challenge. And certainly, Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, has a lot of experience from his Senate years doing that. And so I'm curious to see, how that if he can, how that his administration rises to that challenge. And also, I think there's going to be a shift more toward the international and global conversation. This is not the president who holds to that kind of America First mentality that President Trump held to. And so I think we're going to see a shift more globally. Certainly, I mean, the tariffs war, as you brought up, Professor Hayes, is something that is embraced by the progressive left, the Senator Sanders types, and then the more populist right, the President Trump types. I don't think you're going to see that being embraced by Biden-Harris administration, nor by the new Congress coming in. And so I think we could see actually a lot move between a slight majority of the Democrat House, a split Senate, and the Biden administration. I think we could see a lot move on the international economic front in the next 4 years.
Yeah, I agree, Sam. And another matter is also just the question of our military entanglements around the world, and this, the endless wars that we engage in. And I think right now the numbers are between 2,000 and 3,000 American troops in Afghanistan. And Donald Trump is trying to get that down to a smaller number. Of course, Afghanistan is just there's no good option. You can leave, and then bad things happen to a lot of people who don't deserve to have bad things happen to them. But on the other hand, how much American blood, do we lose on foreign soil? Judicious application of power is a very tricky thing. Mm-hmm. We had the military might, but with that, sanity must also be a factor. And we have troops around the world, but we have them right now fighting and dying in Afghanistan, even in an advisory role. And I really wonder, Sam, whether during the Biden administration we're going to finally get out of that country, that poor, sad, war-torn country where we've been fighting for almost 20 years now.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a toss-up, to be honest. And I'm also curious if Congress will finally step up and take the responsibility on international conflicts. We think back to how we got there, right? 2003, war in Iraq, where Congress was asked for an authorization, or President Bush asked Congress for an authorization of war, and they really just kicked the authority back to the White House, which is an abdication of their constitutional responsibility. And so I would like to see Congress kind of step back into this and say, hey, this is our job, and let's actually start governing, rather than giving fancy speeches on C-SPAN and kicking responsibility to the White House.
Yeah, and I defer to the historians, in our midst here on answering this, but I wonder whether executive action, which is really a tool now that's been wielded by Obama, certainly did, and to Trump, that really executive action to bypass Congress. It seems as if, well, we want to give the president enough leeway to operate, but on the other hand, if he usurps the role of Congress to approve military action and that sort of thing, where do we go? It's a tricky balancing act, allowing presidents to have executive action to do what they wish without any approval from advice and consent of Congress.
I agree. And I think, go ahead, Chris, go ahead.
I was just going to say there are many global issues to consider. I'm just wondering, what about the issues right here at home locally?
I mean, goodness. At first, Chris, thank you. Chris is doing us the great favor keeping an eye on the clock today, because I mean, yeah, everyone knows that if you left it to Rob and I, we could talk forever. I think, and to piggyback off what we're talking about, I think when you look at locally, this is the same. The executive question of executive power is also applies here, and we've seen this with Governor Wolf in this state. With the emergency declaration. And again, we're looking at a pandemic, COVID-19, that nobody's ever had to deal with. We don't really know what the right or wrong thing to do is. And yet you've got a situation with this governor where the Republicans and the Democrats in the state legislature have voted against him. The ACLU has pressed against him on the issues of transparency and open records. The entire state's media has been very frustrated with how unforthcoming this administration has been. And so I think the same questions apply at all the levels. What I'm interested in is now that the president has lost, now that the election's over and that President Trump is out, what happens in the off-year elections? We're coming in 2021. The Northampton County and Lehigh County both have commissioner races, executive races. There are municipal races and races in all of our cities. And what's that lingering effect now that the Trump administration is on their way out? What's gonna, does the MAGA crowd, if you will, still have an impact coming into the local politics in 2021? That's where my curiosity sits.
Yeah, and again, as with the national election, the down ballot candidates, Republicans did pretty well in Pennsylvania. I live in a rural area. I of course teach at the college in Bethlehem, but I live in a rural area, and most of the signage around here was Trump, Pence. And we have two Americas. We have two Americas. We have it within Pennsylvania. And if you look at how the election went across the state, you see that there's islands of blue, that being the Lehigh Valley, Monroe County, Philadelphia County, Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is, Harrisburg area, and up in State College. The rest of the state is red. And in fact, in two southern tier counties, Fulton County and an adjoining county, they had about between 83 and 85% for Trump. And so this polarization exists within our own state, and finding a way forward within state politics is also going to be a challenge. And I agree with Sam. I mean, I like Governor Wolf for a lot of things, and also there are questions here about transparency. And this gets into my own area, which was this journalism. And the numbers of journalists who cover state politics across the country is vastly lower than it used to be. In fact, the number of journalists working in newspapers since 2000 is about half of what it was back 20 years ago. And that has consequences, has real life consequences that we, the people, do not necessarily know what's going on in the corridors of power. There are some bright signs. There's an organization, Spotlight Pennsylvania, a nonprofit that really tries to keep a close eye on Harrisburg to let us know what's going on, and we need that. We need that. For journalism, the problem is finding a sustainable revenue model. It may be anathema to many journalists, but I think that we really need to examine, if not outright government support, certainly tax breaks for subscriptions and things like that, to encourage people to consume the content. Or digital subscription doesn't cost that much, but it may mean the difference for people who are cash strapped. And what we need to have it comes back down to an informed citizenry. What do you know? And you get what you deserve in government, it is said. And to be sidelined and not know what's going on encourages you not to get involved. And we need people involved. We just had a historic turnout for the presidential election. 80 million people voted for Joe Biden, and I believe about 74 75 million voted for Donald Trump. That's great in terms of participating in democracy, but what did the people know who voted based on what they learned from our news media?
Mhm.
And that picture is not quite so rosy. It's very partisan. We've returned to the partisanship in journalism that we had back in the 1790s, for God's sakes, when the parties were affiliated. The newspapers were affiliated with the parties, which actually bankrolled them. So we're in a very partisan climate, a different economic reality, but we do need to find a sustainable revenue model to ensure that we have journalism, which is, I would call it the fourth leg of government, because it's what keeps the public informed about what's going on. And it is called the fourth estate. So I guess that's not a novel idea.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Tom Shortell, who writes for the Morning Call and is on here today, and we'll probably throw a question to him in here in a little bit. But Tom was on my show not that long ago talking about local journalism. And one of the points that he made was, he said, you go somewhere like the Slate Belt, and they don't have a local paper dedicated to covering them anymore. And so when things go on in your boroughs, right? If you're from the borough of Bangor, Pennsylvania, and things are going on there, who are we relying on to cover it? Because there's no way. We all love watching CNN or Fox News, depending on our partisan ilk. But there is no way they're going to cover something that's going on in the borough of Penn Argyl or Bangor or Lower Mackenzie Township or anything like that. I remember a few years ago, there's a gentleman running for, I think it was clerk of courts in Berks County, Pennsylvania, and this was shortly after the 2004 presidential election. It was the year 2005. He was running for a clerkship position in Berks County, and he was knocking doors, and a woman said, "Well, are you Republican or Democrat?" And he said, "I'm a Republican." And she said, "Well, I can't vote for you." And he said, "Well, why is that?" And she said, "Well, because you invaded Iraq." And he said, "Well, ma'am, I promise if you elect me clerk of courts in Berks County, Pennsylvania, I will never abuse this position to invade a foreign country or the state of New Jersey." And she laughed, and he ended up winning her vote. But I think it goes to illustrate the reality that we are all enamored by national headlines, right? But at some point, the TVs go off. At some point, our social media devices, we turn them off. And we're focused now on things that impact us every single day. If we have money for tuition, if we're going to make our next paycheck will pay our bills. These are the things that start to matter. And on those questions, the local direction is so much more impactful than the federal direction, than the national direction. Former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, said all politics is local, right? And I think he's exactly right. And it worries me that, in Allentown, a few years ago, you have a mayor who is being pursued by the FBI, who's now in prison, and he's up for re-election. And you would think that this would generate a lot of turnout. And 7% of the city of Allentown voted. 7%. When there is a mayor under investigation by the FBI on the ballot. And I think to Professor Hayes' point, if we don't have local journalism, we're not going to understand the issues that are impacting us on the local level. I mean, there are so many debates going on in the counties, in your townships, about directions, about things like defunding the police, about local ways of addressing climate change, about funding for your libraries, about funding for your school taxes, right? These are questions that are going on that we're not unaware of, and yet it's kind of our fault in the sense that because we don't care, we don't support local journalism, and therefore we're left in the dark.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have an example in front of me. Actually, I have it across my table here. It'd be awkward for me to lean over during this discussion. But, about a month ago, I got this newspaper into my mailbox. And in fact, if you'll bear with me, guys, I'm going to walk around and just grab it because I think this illustrates the whole question of where you get your content and how accurate it is. Here it is. And I teach Journalism Society, one of our journalism courses, and I actually ran this by, excuse me for that interruption there. I ran it by my class, this is what we're getting, that passes as journalism. This is called Pennsylvania Catholic Tribune, all right? It's 8 pages. I was a little curious that there were no advertisements in it. That's interesting. That's a little different. And I started reading the articles. They were decidedly pro-Trump, decidedly in all ways. And it represented itself as independent journalism. I did a little research, and it was actually the guy who's running it is a fellow in Chicago, has a lot of publications much like this across the country. And in the vacuum, nature abhors a vacuum. And in the absence of solid local journalism, what will fill the bill in its absence? And I think it's stuff like this. The fact that there's no advertising right away was like, whoa, something's going on here. Somebody's got to pay the bills. And what is their agenda? I think we understand, even in the era of alternative facts, that facts matter, that verifiable facts matter, data is relevant, science is relevant, and we trust that we want to have trust in what we are reading and hearing. And right now we're getting narratives that feed into this polarization, and we do need to find ways to support journalism on the local level, because as Tip O'Neill said, as you just said, Sam, politics is very local. It begins home, right in your backyard.
Well, why don't we turn it over to those people in the backyard then and look at some of these questions that have come in. A big one that I'm sure we're all wondering comes in from Natalie Winters, who asks, what is the biggest challenge facing us? Is it uniting the divided country? Is it COVID? Is that question one and the same? Those two things. What do you think about that?
Sam?
But first, hi, Natalie. Natalie's one of my outstanding students, and so it's good to see you, Natalie. Wow, I mean, I think it's a great question. I do think they're one and the same in the sense that if we don't govern, and you can't govern if you're not united, right? I mean, you look right now, there's a divided government. And you can't govern if we don't find some things common ground to unite on. And this is why divided governments tend to do better than when one party holds the reins, because they do come together and they find that common ground. So I don't think you solve the COVID crisis without coming together. I don't think you solve climate change without coming together. I don't think we solve any of the issues that we're being faced with if we don't come together. Now, it's not dramatic, right? And we like things that are dramatic, but it's good governance. So I think the largest problem that we're facing in government isn't so much right or left, Republican or Democrat. It's the fundamental question of if we can govern. And the Constitution lays out very specific guidelines on what that looks like for us. All right, for example, the legislative branch writes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets and applies the laws. I mean, that's a very, very simplified version of it. But why are we protesting at the Supreme Court if they're not the ones that are drafting policy? If they're merely interpreting and applying laws, shouldn't we be protesting at Congress? And so I think basic governance is probably the biggest challenge that we face, because if we allow our partisanship to interfere with our ability to govern, we can't solve any of the problems that we face.
And I agree with you entirely. And I'm going to circle back to my own backyard, which is journalism and its role in all this. You talked about the issue of defunding the police, which is a misnomer. It doesn't mean you stop supporting your police. My God, no. It simply means a different allocation of monies to actually enhance policing in ways that lead to outcomes that are far better than some of the outcomes we've seen in police departments across the country. But it's not taking money away necessarily from law enforcement. Yet there's that perception among many people, and that's where journalism ought to help explain what is meant by that.
I think a lot of that is on us in the political world. I mean, I just saw a debate today. Congresswoman Cori Bush was upset that President Obama said we shouldn't use the term defund the police. And she goes, no, I want to take money away from the police. And to your point, Professor Hayes, you're like, wait, hold on a minute. That's not like, what are we talking about? Two different policy issues and using the same tagline. And so I think that's on us in the political arena, where we don't communicate effectively.
Yeah. How
can we expect journalists to report effectively if we're not communicating effectively?
Yeah. And we've also reduced our democracy to what social media makes it. I think we all need to detox actually and step away a little bit from the snares of social media because of what it perpetuates, which is a lot of misinformation.
Mhm.
And also, we there's something called the journalism of affirmation, where basically you just plug into those sources that affirm that what you already believe is correct. So naturally, it is correct because I believe it to be that way. Yeah, I would urge everybody, if we're talking about trying to find a way through 2020, I would urge or 2021, I urge everybody to become a news omnivore and not to rely on just one or two sources. And for God's sakes, don't make social media your prime source. Look at Wall Street Journal and Washington Post. There's nice bookends. Of course, the Wall Street Journal's got a very conservative editorial page, but the content is they play it down the middle in the news department, and the Post is more liberal, but it's got a lot to offer. NPR, PBS, find your source. There's an awful lot out there. 538 is for politics. They do a lot of that number crunching, data analysis, which I relied on election night and the days ahead. So become a news omnivore and tap into, and not just Americans, guys. Look to Al Jazeera, look to the BBC. Find foreign news sources. There's some good ones for Africa, Europe, that lets you know about the rest of the world. The other 7 point, do the math, 3 billion people. What's going on there? We need to be citizens of the world. That's what Northampton has always, tried to do, is to promote global awareness. It's actually one of the fundamental, values that we try to promote is an awareness of the rest of the world. But it begins with each of us to tap a variety of sources and then form our own conclusions, not to be force-fed ideas and narratives that may have an agenda behind them that on closer examination, maybe we shouldn't really support.
Well, this segues well into an interesting question from Andrew McIntosh pertaining to those individuals on the far end of the political spectrum. Andrew asks, isn't the nuance of their stances important to challenge the status quo of centrists?
Interesting question. Would you read that again? I want to unpack what was just asked. That's a good question. Is it the role?
So let me go. I don't want to paraphrase him because he put it so well. He says, while I don't relate to the far right and at times nor the far left, isn't the nuance of their stances important to challenge the status quo of centrists? And he goes on to say, this seems particularly important for causes such as economic equity or criminal justice reform.
Yeah, Sam and I are both nodding our head. Absolutely. I think every belief, every position should be challenged to ensure that stance is the right one. And yes, and that's what we need. We need a multitude of voices with different perspectives. And Sam, when we do rely on the outliers, the people even on the fringe, there may be something, as was just mentioned, a nuance that maybe there's a point there to be considered.
I agree. And for those of you who are students here, Dr. McIntosh is a fantastic professor, teaches up at Monroe, so take his class. But I agree. And I think what he hit on there that's so true is the term nuance, right? It is possible to be an extreme centrist. I would say former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, in many ways, kind of rode that line when he was governor, to be an extreme centrist, that everything you're doing, you're trying to force it to the middle. And that's not necessarily governing. I think it is possible to be a conservative pragmatic or a progressive pragmatic, and to hold these ideals and yet to come to a place of governance. And is equally possible to be an extreme centrist that is not pragmatic. And so I think the focus is governing, not necessarily where we fall in the political spectrum, right or left, but the reality that we have to govern, and rubber meets the road. At some point, ideologies aren't going to govern, and we've got to find a way to move forward. And so I do think the nuances from the right and the left are incredibly important toward governing. I also think even when we disagree, in fact, I think we learn more when we are in conversation, in detailed, robust conversation, not trading talking points with people on the right and the left that we disagree with. And so I would absolutely agree. I think that the nuance is exactly where the conversation needs to be.
And kind of building on that thought, Chloe Barzin asks, do you personally feel that the division of opinions will progress or digress the action that must be taken to move forward with the pandemic?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Hi, Chloe. Chloe's another one of my students. I think that's a great question. Yeah, I do think it will hinder progress on the pandemic. I mean, we're at the point where we have people who are dying in hospitals who don't believe the pandemic is real, who don't believe the virus is real. Right? And I think we can debate a lot of logistics and we can debate a lot of if we've done the right things. And there's certainly be lawsuits, I think, when we come out of the pandemic era. But I think that the hyper partisanship where we don't see each other as Americans and fellow citizens in the journey, but we see each other as political combatants. And so instead of us fighting COVID-19, it becomes the Republicans fight the Democrats and COVID-19, and the Democrats fight the Republicans and COVID-19. And so I think we absolutely have to deal with that divisiveness, and not just on a national level, on a local level. And actually, if he's still on here, Tom Fertel is on here. I know Tom has been covering this for the call and has been talking to the local party chairs about what that looks like moving forward and whether or not that kind of partisanship is going to remain. Tom, if you're on here, would love to know what you've heard locally as far as that partisanship goes.
Sure thing. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I'm Tom Schertel. I'm a reporter over at the Morning Call, previously at the Express Times as well, Professor Hayes. Yeah, I've spent the last few days reaching out to some of the party chairs. It's interesting because I really don't know what a local MAGA looks like in terms of like local politics. Like obviously they're Trump supporters, but in terms of policy, because it's like so much of that, like as you said, people get obsessed kind of at politics at the federal level, whether it's immigration, human rights, tariff wars, that sort of thing. That doesn't really apply at the local level, but we still see this tremendous buy-in. People are so passionate one way or the other. Trump's proven so divisive. But so like in Northampton County, Lee Snover is the GOP chairwoman. She is full Trump supporter. She was one of his first supporters in the state of Pennsylvania. Northampton County flipped from supporting Barack Obama to President Trump in 2016. And so like she sees that as her bread and butter, so to speak. She sees the party reinventing itself and moving away from politicians like Charlie, the longtime congressman who is a moderate Republican, who one of my former editors referred to as the canary in the coal mine. When the parties started moving too far right, he'd kind of slam the brakes and go, "Whoa, hold on, guys." On the other end, in Lehigh County, I think we're seeing a party embracing the changes, but not necessarily the rhetoric. Where we've seen what people once referred to as Reagan Democrats. You're kind of blue collar, you're kind of blue collar union type workers who don't necessarily identify with the Democratic Party the way that they used to decades ago. And so I think that over there, they're trying to build a coalition, but not necessarily with that rhetoric or MAGA attitude that we've seen. We've got a couple of races showing up, and so it can be curious to see how they develop and what candidates emerge. And one of the big questions that I have is how the actual process of voting is going to affect things, because we saw mail-in ballots become partisan, which I don't think anyone anticipated a year ago. If that stays the same, how does that affect elections moving forward? Because historically, Democrats don't show up for local races. Republicans have done well, even though they're outnumbered in the Lehigh Valley, because they have better turnout. Does mail-in ballots change that? Like, it's too soon to say for some of this stuff, but that even just the process of how we vote could determine the outcome of our elections.
Tom, are you suggesting that you don't think that divisiveness is going away then?
Not certainly. It's hard to say what the divisiveness has been at the local level, because we've seen it at the state level, we've seen it at the federal level, but I don't know like how that emerges locally, and we haven't seen it either, because as you're talking about, people pay attention to the federal races and they carry it down ballot, and so all the Republicans got voted out in the last 4 years. So we haven't seen they haven't had an opportunity to present, if there was going to be divisiveness presented, because they haven't had office.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's kind of it's too soon to say. And now that both sides are really motivated, well, at least the Republicans have proven to be motivated on this front. Democrats have been motivated the last 2 years. So we'll kind of see how the election cycle turns.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think a couple of some items on the chat function point out, you might decry Trumpism, but well, that's because we tend to demonize everything. There's always a grain of truth or validity to arguments. So oftentimes, what sort of soil did we prepare that allowed Trumpism to take root? And there are issues that cannot be easily dismissed. Why do so many Americans feel disaffected from our political system? I mean, that may be the real issue. How do you make them feel a part of it, that they have a voice? For better, for worse, many who voted for Donald Trump felt they finally had a voice, an expression of what was going on inside them, and that's not to be dismissed. Those are our fellow Americans, and they deserve certainly equal treatment in policy formation.
Samantha Finnegan Liggio asks an interesting question. Could it potentially be a benefit that things have been disrupted from normal for the past 4 years?
The benefits of chaos theory run amok. I don't know. I know one emotion that I think we all share collectively. I can say this fairly confidently, is exhaustion. If you're not exhausted, welcome back to planet Earth. We've been very tired here the last few years, and it's been the theater of the absurd, and it's gone on, and the impossible has become every day. And phrases like the new norm, I'm getting so tired of hearing. The new norm is not normal. Hopefully some sanity will return, but it doesn't mean that we have to return to the way it was before Donald Trump. There are issues that really we can only address collectively, regardless of where we are in the country, regardless of whether we're urban or rural, regardless of any of the other categories that you use in demographics. We sink or swim together.
Yeah, let me echo that. I think that's absolutely right. And hello, Samantha. I think Professor Hayes is absolutely correct. I think that's. I never, even when my candidates win or lose, and I've represented a number of candidates over the years, whether they win or lose, I think there's always a benefit. There's even a benefit in losing, and it reflects on what we learn and what we gain. And it might take a little bit of time for us to see that. I remember 2016, my firm represented Ohio Governor John Kasich, and we obviously lost. And in 2017, we were doing the book tour, Governor Kasich's book about two paths. And we were doing a book tour, and we were down in Philadelphia at the Museum of the American Revolution, and we were about to go on stage, and it was kind of the first moment I had all day with the governor alone, and I just said, "Hey," I said, "Governor, just haven't had a chance, but to say, I'm sorry things didn't go better for us last year. Would have loved for us to be in the White House at this point." And his response was interesting, because he kind of points out the curtain, and there's a room full of people, of Republicans, Democrats, Independents, people that voted all stripes in the last election. And he said, "Do you think I would have this kind of platform if I won?" And he says, "Look, of course we want to win, right? You don't run to not win." He said, "But do you think I would have had this platform if I had won?" He goes, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, people of all stripes coming to hear what we have to say. He goes, look, he goes, winning and losing happens. He says, but there's always a benefit. There's always an opportunity that arises out of it. And that's something that I haven't forgotten. And so I do think, whether we are excited or disappointed from the 2016 election, excited or disappointed from the 2020 election, there is a benefit, to walk away with. There is a lesson to be learned. The question remains whether we learn it. And I think there are obvious lessons for the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. It was not a good night for either party in many regards. And so the question becomes, do we learn it? And if we learn it, then yes, there's absolutely a benefit.
Well, we may only have time for one more question, but this is a good one from Sharon Kendall. Do you think that with more moderate in the White House, will media be more moderate?
All right, I guess I'm up at the plate on that one. We'll take a swing at it. No, I don't think so. I think, the tail that wags the dog is money. And it's hard to see if Fox or CNN or MSNBC backing away if they finally get the ratings by speaking to their narrower audiences. I don't have a lot of faith in cable TV news, but we can always hope. I'm a print journalist guy, so I hope print journalism maybe will lead the way as when it straightens out its revenue model that I talked about earlier. But geez, I wish I could be more optimistic.
And Professor Kendall is also in journalism for our students here who are looking for. You have two fabulous journalism professors here with us today. I have to agree. I think a lot. I was in a forum like this and a while back, and a dear friend of mine, I won't say which network she's with, but she said, media doesn't have a bent to the right or to the left. It has a bent to the dramatic. I think it's exactly what Professor Hayes just said. There is a bent to the dramatic, and as long as there is drama, they're going to keep feeding that bent. And we kind of ask for it, right? We like the dramatic things. Congressman Chet Edwards was a moderate Democrat from the Waco, Texas region. He represented George W. Bush's district. And in election years where President Bush won 66, 68% of that vote, he would, as a Democrat, would walk away with a good 59, 60% himself. He was turning a lot of Republican votes. And one of the things he said was he was a subcommittee chairman on the Appropriations Committee. And he said all of his bills, this is about transportation and infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, the infrastructure of our country, impacts all of us, Republican or Democrat. So he wanted to make sure that those bills came out with strong bipartisan input. And he made sure these bills came out of his committee with unanimous votes, and they would go to the House, and you always have maybe a handful of people oppose it, but they would come out of the House 423 to 5 or 418 to 7. And he said that what you knew is that when you finish this vote, it is the biggest vote you're going to get. It is one of the most bipartisan efforts you're going to have all Congress, and not a single media outlet's going to cover it because it's not dramatic. But that's the art of good governance, right? That's what we have to get back to doing. And so, if we don't demand good governance, if we continuously eat up the drama, then the media is going to continue to report the drama, and our elected officials are going to continue to play up the drama. And so that's why I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to see a return to normalcy in that sense.
It's a vicious circle. I've always favored the journalism of the Christian Science Monitor, which is solution oriented. It tries to turn down the rhetoric, turn down the temperature, and actually address the solutions to problems. And I'm glad Sam, by the way, just mentioned infrastructure. That is a major national issue.
Mm-hmm.
It would really be nice to cross the bridge knowing that it's not going to collapse before you reach the other side. And sad to say that has been true in some places where the bridge did go down. But that is actually an opportunity. Challenge comes the opportunity, and that means jobs in rebuilding the infrastructure, and also this green economy that Joe Biden talks about, and the creation of new jobs. He's very right about that. I mean, we need to look to the future for our economy, not to the past of industries that are not coming back for a lot of reasons. But there are many more new industries ahead, but we have to be forward thinking and hit the fast forward button and establish those jobs that provide the income that Americans need to find a way in the new economy. And infrastructure, I think there a lot of money can be spent there. That's just well spent money.
Well, there were a lot more great questions in the feed. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we'll have time to get to all of them. Should we wrap it up and conclude here on that note?
Yeah, why don't we kick it back over to Professor Fallows and for some closing remarks, and then we can wrap it up.
All right. Thank you very much, both Professor Sam and Professor Robert Hayes. I am also grateful for our moderator, the editor of the school paper, The Commuter, Chris. Chris, I'm blanking on your name. Chris Trey. I'm sorry, my friend. He's one of my former students, and I blanked on his name. I feel so bad. I'm kidding.
I blanked on yours, too, because I always called you Professor K.
Yeah. It's all right. I have a forgettable face. Don't worry. So with that, we did have a lot of interesting questions that did get voiced. Unfortunately, there were a lot more. Professor Chen placed both his and Professor Hayes' email in the chat if you would like to follow up with them on any of the points they made today, because they did cover a lot of ground regarding where we're going politically and what we can do to find solutions and find better sources and be omnivores regarding our news sources. So thanks, everybody, for coming. Thank you to our speakers and our moderator, and have a great day.